The snow had been falling since before dawn, and by the time Caleb Mercer walked out to check the fence line along the north pasture, it was coming down sideways. He didn't mind. He'd lived through worse. Blizzards that buried fence posts up to the cap, cold snaps that split cottonwoods clean down the middle. A winter 7 years back that had killed 40 head of cattle overnight and left him standing in a field of frozen shapes he couldn't bring himself to look at directly. Wyoming had a way of reminding a man exactly how small he was, and Caleb had long since stopped fighting the reminder. He pulled his coat tighter, bent his head into the wind, and kept walking. The Mercer Ranch sat on 11,000 acres of high grassland east of Laramie, bracketed to the north by a ridgeline and to the south by a creek that ran fast in summer and sluggish under ice in winter. It was serious land, not the prettiest country in the territory, too flat and exposed for that, but productive land, the kind that rewarded anyone willing to work it without complaint. Caleb had inherited the original deed from his father 21 years ago at the age of 19, when the holding was still just 1,800 acres and 2 leaky outbuildings, and he had grown it into something that attracted attention from men twice his age and half his patience. He employed 11 ranch hands full-time, kept a herd that ranged between 400 and 500 cattle, depending on the season, and ran the whole operation with a methodical, close-fisted precision that his foreman, a leathery man named Garrett Swade, privately compared to watching a clockmaker build a pocket watch with blacksmith tools. It worked. That was the thing people didn't want to admit. Caleb Mercer's manner was severe, his silences were uncomfortable, and his hospitality was essentially non-existent. But the operation he ran was a serious enterprise, and serious men in the territory respected it even when they didn't particularly like the man behind it. He reached the north fence and walked it for a quarter mile, checking posts, testing wire, finding nothing that needed immediate attention. The snow was already 2 inches deeper than it had been at sunup. He turned back toward the ranch house, and that was when he saw the wagon. It was a modest rig, a single horse pulling a canvas-covered buckboard, moving slowly up the access road that cut through his lower pasture. Caleb stopped walking and watched it. He had not invited anyone. He had not been expecting any supply delivery until Thursday at the earliest, and this didn't look like a supply rig. It moved too carefully, too tentatively, as if the driver wasn't entirely sure of the route or wasn't entirely sure of the welcome at the end of it. He felt the familiar clench in his chest that he associated with certain kinds of visitors, and he turned and walked back to the ranch house at a pace that was, perhaps, slightly faster than necessary. Garrett Swade was at the kitchen table when Caleb came in, working through a second cup of coffee and a stack of feed receipts he'd been trying to reconcile for the better part of a week. He looked up, clocked Caleb's expression, and set down his cup. "Wagon coming up the road," Caleb said, pulling off his gloves. "I can see it from here." Garrett nodded toward the window. "Don't recognize the rig." "Neither do I." Garrett went back to his receipts. "Want me to go out?" "No," Caleb said. "I'll handle it." He said it the way he said most things. Not harshly, exactly, but without any warmth to soften it. Garrett, who had worked for the man for 9 years, understood that "I'll handle it" could mean a range of things depending on context, and in this context it probably meant "this is going to be unpleasant, and I don't want to witness." He turned a receipt over and kept his eyes down. Caleb stood at the front window and watched the wagon come to a stop in the yard. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the canvas at the back of the buckboard moved and a woman climbed down. She wasn't what he expected. She wasn't what anyone who'd been watching would have expected, given the visitors the Mercer Ranch had received over the past several years. She wore a plain wool coat, dark gray, with a collar turned up against the wind. Her boots were practical rather than decorative. She had no escort, no father standing beside her, no mother hovering at the wagon's edge, nobody at all. Just her, climbing down from a wagon she'd apparently driven herself, looking around the yard with an expression that Caleb couldn't quite read from this distance. She was not young in the way people meant when they said young, not 17, not fresh from a parlor somewhere. She looked to be somewhere in her late 20s, maybe 30, with dark hair tucked mostly under a hat that had seen better days. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look eager either. She looked like someone who had made a decision and was carrying it through regardless of how it felt. She walked toward the front door and knocked. Caleb opened it before she'd finished the second knock. Up close, she had a quality he couldn't immediately name. Something in the steadiness of her eyes, maybe, or the fact that she didn't smile reflexively the way most people did when caught off guard in an unfamiliar situation. She simply looked at him and said, "Mr. Mercer?" "That's right. My name is Hannah Reed." She paused as if deciding how much to add. "I've come about the advertisement." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "Come in then." He should clarify here what the advertisement was and wasn't. Caleb had not placed the advertisement himself. That distinction mattered to him, although he'd long since stopped explaining it to anyone who brought the subject up, because explaining it required telling a longer story than he had interest in telling. The advertisement had been placed 2 months ago by a woman named Clara Prentice, who was the wife of his county commissioner, and who had decided, without consulting Caleb, that what the Mercer Ranch needed was a woman's hand, and what Caleb Mercer needed was a wife, and she had taken it upon herself to do something about both problems simultaneously. The advertisement had run in 3 newspapers, one in Laramie, one in Cheyenne, and one, for reasons Caleb still didn't fully understand, in a paper out of Omaha. It had described a prosperous Wyoming ranch, a man of stable financial standing, and an opportunity for a capable woman interested in frontier life. It had not, to Caleb's knowledge, described the man in terms that would have been recognizable to anyone who actually knew him. 3 women had come in response in the weeks before Hannah Reed. The first had arrived with her father and 2 trunks and had taken one look at the spare interior of the ranch house and asked whether there was perhaps a larger property nearby. The second had been perfectly pleasant for approximately 40 minutes, at which point she had asked about the nearest church and seemed genuinely distressed by Caleb's silence on the matter. The third had been the most straightforward of the 3. She had studied him openly across the kitchen table, calculated something, and announced that she had other prospects she'd be considering, as though she were doing him a courtesy by letting him know. Caleb had told Clara Prentice, after the third one, that the advertisement needed to stop. Clara had told him he was being unreasonable. Caleb had stopped returning her calls. And yet here, apparently, was a 4th respondent, one who had not gotten the message that the situation was no longer in effect, or who had gotten it and come anyway. Hannah Reed sat at his kitchen table with her coat still on, though she'd taken her hat off and set it on the table beside her. She had dark eyes that moved around the kitchen in an observational way, not critically, not appraisingly, just looking, taking things in. She didn't fill the silence with nervous conversation, which was, Caleb realized, the first thing about her that surprised him. He poured coffee without asking and set a cup in front of her. "Thank you," she said. He sat down across the table. "You've come from where?" "Cheyenne, most recently." A pause. "Before that, a few different places." "Alone?" "Yes." "You drove that wagon from Cheyenne alone in this weather?" She looked at him without particular defensiveness. "The snow started this morning. I'd been on the road 3 days before that." Caleb studied her. "The advertisement," he said, "was placed without my knowledge. I didn't ask for it, and I've been trying to call the whole thing off for 2 weeks. Hannah nodded slowly. "I figured something like that might be the case." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "The woman who placed it, Mrs. Prentice, I think, wrote back to me after I'd already left Cheyenne. She said the situation had changed. I was already on the road." "So you kept coming anyway?" "I'd already left," she said again, "and I had nowhere particular to be going back to." There was something in the way she said that last part. Not self-pity, not a bid for sympathy, just a flat statement of fact, the way you might tell someone the road ahead was washed out. It was, Caleb thought, an oddly honest thing to say to a stranger. "That's a long drive," he said, "for a situation that may not exist." "It is," she agreed, "but I've made longer ones for worse reasons." Garrett came through the kitchen around noon, looked at the woman sitting at the table, looked at Caleb, and went back the way he'd come with an expression of careful neutrality that Caleb found mildly irritating. By then, the conversation had moved, or perhaps shifted is the better word, since it hadn't moved in any direction with purpose. It had simply unfolded the way conversations sometimes do when 2 people have exhausted the obvious subjects and are left with the less obvious ones. Hannah had told him she was 29, that she had some experience managing books and accounts, that she could cook, though not particularly elaborately. that she had grown up in Illinois and had come west 7 years ago. She'd offered this information without embellishment, which he found easier to process than the performances he'd sat through with the previous 3 women. He had told her in return that the ranch ran on a strict schedule, that he was not a sociable man by inclination or practice, that the winters were hard and the summers were short, and the nearest town was 40 minutes in decent weather and considerably longer when the roads were bad. "I know what frontier winters are," she said. "Do you?" "I've spent the last 4 winters north of Laramie." She paused. "That's where I was coming from, actually. I've been working for a family up there, the Hargrove family, keeping their house, managing the household accounts." Another pause, shorter. It ended. "I needed something else." "Ended how?" She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Hargrove decided his interest in me wasn't strictly professional." She said it without drama. "When I made my position on that clear, the situation became difficult to continue." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "And before Hargrove?" Her hands, he noticed, had tightened slightly around the cup. "I was married," she said. "For 3 years, my husband died." He waited for more. She didn't offer more, not immediately, and he didn't push. He understood, without being able to say exactly how, that there was something beneath the surface of that sentence that she'd decided, for now, to leave there. "I'm sorry," he said, because it seemed like the appropriate thing. "I'm not," she said quietly, and then, as though she'd surprised herself, "That's not... I don't mean... It's complicated." "Most things are." She looked at him again with that steady look. "You're easier to talk to than I expected." "People tend to expect the worst," he said. "I'd heard you were difficult." "Who told you that?" "Mrs. Prentice's letter mentioned it, in what I think she intended to be a positive light." A trace of something crossed Hannah's face, not quite a smile, but close to one. "She called you a man of particular standards." Despite himself, Caleb felt something in his chest shift slightly. "That's a charitable interpretation." "I thought so too." He showed her the spare room that afternoon, the one at the back of the house that had been used for storage since his father's time, and now contained 3 broken chairs, a crate of old ledgers, and a saddle that needed resoling. He told her, standing in the doorway, that she was welcome to stay one night while the weather sorted itself, and that in the morning they could decide whether there was anything further to discuss. She thanked him without excessive warmth, which he appreciated. He went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a while, watching the snow. The thing was, he'd known he was being watched from the moment she came through the door. Not watched the way some women watched, cataloging, assessing, running calculations he'd learned to recognize as quickly as he recognized the sound of the wind coming off the ridge. Hannah Reed had looked at him differently. More like the way a person looks at something they're genuinely trying to understand, without having already decided what they'll find. He didn't know what to do with that. Dinner that evening was a plain affair. Caleb had never learned to cook beyond necessity, and his skill ran to beans, salt pork, and whatever could be thrown together without much ceremony. He set it on the table, and Hannah sat across from him, and they ate mostly in silence, which was fine. Caleb had never seen silence as something that needed fixing. About halfway through the meal, she said, "Can I ask you something personal?" He looked up. "You can ask. You have this place." She gestured, a small movement that seemed to take in the ranch house, the land, everything. "You've built something significant. Most men in your position most men would have settled into a life with someone by now. A family." She stopped. "I know that sounds like a presumptuous thing to say." "It does," he agreed. "But you can still ask." "Why haven't you?" The fire in the stove popped. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the walls with a sound like the ranch house was taking a breath it couldn't quite let go. Caleb set his fork down. "There was someone," he said. "Years ago." Hannah waited. She had a quality of patience that he was starting to recognize. She didn't rush in to fill space with noise, which made it easier to say things that were difficult to say. Her name was Josephine Alcott. It was 7 years ago, before the ranch was as large as it is now. I was 27. She came from a family in Cheyenne. He stopped, picked up his fork, set it down again. We were going to be married. She left 3 weeks before the wedding. For someone else? For a better opportunity, he said. That was how she explained it in the letter. Not someone exactly, a situation. Her family had arranged something more advantageous. She apologized, said she hoped I'd understand. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't understand. Hannah didn't say I'm sorry or how awful or any of the things people generally said to fill that kind of silence. She just sat with it, and after a minute she said, "And you've been deciding ever since that it would never happen again." Something like that. By making sure no one got close enough. Something like that, he said again. She looked at him across the table. The lamplight made her face harder to read, but he got the sense that she wasn't judging what he'd told her. She was simply placing it somewhere, putting it in context of something she understood from her own angle. That's a hard way to live, she said. It's reliable. Reliable and good aren't the same thing. He looked at her. No, he said. They're not. She was still there in the morning. The snow had stopped, but the roads were bad enough that he didn't mention it, and she didn't ask about leaving, and so the day proceeded. Caleb went out early with Garrett and two of the hands to check on the cattle and break ice along the watering troughs. When he came back at mid-morning, he found that Hannah had cleared the storage from the spare room, stacking everything neatly in the hall, and was in the process of hauling the broken chairs out to the back porch. He stood in the doorway of the room and looked at the neat pile in the hall. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." She was breathing a little hard from the work. But the room needed it, and I needed something to do. He looked at the room, then at her. One of those chairs can probably be fixed. I thought so too. The back left leg is just loose. It's not broken through. He nodded slowly. I'll look at it. She went back to the porch with the third chair. He stood there a moment longer, looking at the neat stack of ledgers she'd organized against the wall, and then went to find his tools. The days that followed had a shape that neither of them had planned and neither of them acknowledged directly. Hannah was not officially anything, not hired, not engaged, not a guest in any formal sense. She occupied the back room and she worked because she was not a person who could tolerate idleness, and because the ranch house had been running for years without any proper domestic management, which showed in the state of the kitchen shelves and the account books, and the general condition of things that weren't cattle or fences and therefore hadn't received Caleb's particular attention. She found the account ledgers on her third day and spent an evening looking through them. "You're overpaying for feed," she told him the next morning. He looked up from his coffee. "I'm what?" "Harmon's mill in town is charging you 12 cents more per hundredweight than the Reardon operation east of Casper. The difference in a season would cover the wages of another hand." She pushed the ledger across the table toward him. I ran the numbers twice. He looked at the numbers. Then he looked at her. "Harmon's closer," he said. "By 30 miles, yes, but the Reardon operation delivers on contract." He was quiet for a moment, reading through her notations in the margin. Her handwriting was small and precise. "You did this last night?" "I wasn't sleeping." A pause. "I don't sleep well in new places." He turned another page. She'd flagged 3 other line items. A credit he hadn't noticed from a vendor 2 seasons ago, an insurance payment that appeared to have been double billed, and what appeared to be a calculation error in the previous spring's cattle count that had slightly understated his tax basis. She'd worked all of this out from ledgers she hadn't been invited to look at, in a house she hadn't been invited to stay in, for a man who hadn't asked for any of it. "You could have just told me there were problems," he said. "It's easier to show than to tell," she said, "with numbers." He turned one more page. "Where'd you learn to keep books like this?" "My father was an accountant." Her tone shifted slightly, not closed off exactly, but careful. "I worked with him for years before I married." He noticed the "before I married" and chose not to ask about it. He'd learned in these past few days that Hannah Reed moved toward difficult subjects in her own time and on her own terms, and that trying to accelerate that process got you nothing but a politely shut door. "I'll write to Reardon this week," he said. She nodded, pulled the ledger back across the table, and went back to what she'd been doing. Garrett cornered Caleb at the barn that afternoon. "You planning on keeping her around?" he asked, without preamble. Garrett, I'm just asking because the men are starting to wonder and I'd rather know so I can tell them to mind their business with actual information. Caleb leaned against the stall door. One of the horses, a bay mare named August, pushed her nose against his shoulder. I don't know, he said, which was honest. Garrett studied him. She seems capable. She is. Settled? Yes. Different from the others. Caleb was quiet. Garrett, who was not an insensitive man, let the quiet sit for a respectful moment and then said, What's she running from? I don't know all of it yet. But something. Something, Caleb agreed. Garrett turned to go and then turned back. Boss, I've worked for you 9 years. I've watched you run off 19 prospects. 19 is an exaggeration. And I've never once seen you let someone into those ledgers. Just saying. He shrugged and walked out of the barn. Caleb stood there with the mare breathing against his shoulder and the cold coming through the boards and thought about that for a while. It was the end of the first week when Hannah told him something she clearly hadn't planned to tell him. They were sitting near the stove after supper, Caleb with a survey map he'd been meaning to look over, and Hannah with a mending project. One of his shirts, which she'd taken on without being asked, which he'd decided not to comment on. The evening had that quality that evenings in a well-heated room sometimes get in winter, when the dark outside and the cold pressing against the glass make the inside feel more present than usual, more real. She said out of nowhere, My husband didn't die in any ordinary way. Caleb lowered the map slightly. He was shot, she said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was working hard to stay that way. In a card game. He drank. When he drank, he made bad decisions, and one night he made a decision that another man felt strongly about correcting. She was looking at the work in her hands rather than at Caleb. I'd been trying to leave him for over a year by then. I hadn't managed it yet. Caleb said nothing. He'd learned that she talked through silences, not around them. The first year was normal enough, she went on. He had good qualities at the beginning, or I thought he did. I was very young, and I mistook charm for character, which is a mistake a lot of people make and then spend a long time paying for. She finally looked up. He hit me the second year, not once, several times. By the third year, I had enough sense to understand the situation wasn't going to improve, and enough fear to have trouble figuring out how to get out of it. You didn't have family to go to? My parents were both gone by then, and I was ashamed, she said plainly. That's the part people don't talk about. The shame of having made a bad choice and then not being able to unmake it. I felt like if I went to anyone for help, I'd have to explain how I'd gotten there, and I couldn't. She stopped. I couldn't bear to do that. But you were trying to leave. I was working up to it, saving money, trying to figure out where I'd go. She looked back down at the shirt. And then he died, and I didn't have to. And I felt. She stopped again. Relieved? He said. She looked at him sharply as though expecting judgment in the word and found none. Her shoulders came down slightly. Yes, which I thought meant something was wrong with me. It meant you were human, he said, and that you'd been in a bad situation for a long time. She was quiet. Then, have you always been this straightforward? More or less. People find it difficult? Most people, he said, prefer to be told comfortable things. And you won't? I found they don't help much. He set the map aside. For what it's worth, what you said about feeling relieved, that's not something wrong with you. That's what happens when something that's been hurting you stops hurting you. You feel the absence of pain. That's not a character defect. That's just what it is. Hannah looked at him for a long moment, and he noticed that her eyes had gone slightly bright. Not crying exactly, but close to it, which he didn't think was about anything he'd said specifically. More like something that had been held in place for a long time, had been allowed to shift, just slightly, and the shift itself had a physical quality. She blinked, looked back down at the shirt, and made 2 careful stitches before she said, Thank you for that. Don't mention it, he said, and picked the map back up. But he didn't look at it for a while. The week after that, a man named Douglas Fitch rode up from Laramie. Fitch was a cattle broker who had done business with the Mercer Ranch for 4 years and who operated with a particular style that Caleb had always found faintly distasteful. The handshake that lasted too long, the smile that was one size too wide, the habit of making everything feel like a favor being done rather than a transaction being conducted. He showed up on a Wednesday morning unannounced and found Caleb in the near pasture checking on a heifer that had been showing signs of difficulty. "Mercer," he said, swinging down from his horse with the easy manner of a man who expected to be welcomed everywhere. "Thought I'd come check in. Heard you've got new company up here." He glanced toward the ranch house with an expression that Caleb found immediately irritating. "Business can wait until I'm finished here," Caleb said, without looking up from the heifer. Of course, of course." Fitch stood a little to the left, hands in his coat pockets, surveying the pasture. "Just curious. Woman staying out here. Unusual is all. People talk." "People do," Caleb agreed. "She a relative?" Caleb straightened and looked at him. "Miss Reed is staying at the ranch. Any business you have is with me, not with her. If you've got something to discuss, we'll discuss it inside when I'm done here. If you've got questions about my domestic situation, you can take them back to Laramie with you." Fitch showed the too wide smile again, slightly reduced now. "Just being neighborly." "Laramie's 40 minutes that direction," Caleb said, pointing. Inside later, Hannah had put coffee on and was at the kitchen table with a catalog she'd found, going through winter equipment prices with a pencil. She looked up when Caleb and Fitch came through the door, assessed Fitch in about 2 seconds, and looked back down at her catalog. Fitch introduced himself with slightly more reserve than he'd shown outside. Hannah nodded and said something polite and noncommittal and went back to her catalog. Fitch's eyes followed her in a way that Caleb noticed and filed. They talked business for 20 minutes. Fitch wanted to renegotiate a contract rate, which he did every year and which Caleb expected, and they went back and forth on it in the way they always did, Fitch starting high and walking it back in increments. At one point, Fitch mentioned, with a sort of casual emphasis, that a ranch 2 counties over had gone to a different broker and had seen a notable improvement in their per-head return, which Caleb recognized as a pressure tactic and ignored accordingly. When Fitch stood up to go, he looked at Hannah again and said, "You planning on keeping the place long-term, Miss Reed? Must be a bit isolated out here." Hannah looked up from her catalog. "I don't mind isolation," she said. "That's the thing about it, though," Fitch said, with the tone of a man sharing wisdom he hadn't been asked for. "Seems fine until it gets to you. Women generally need more society, more activity. It wears on them out here." There was a pause. "Thank you," Hannah said pleasantly, "for the observation." And she looked back down at her catalog. Caleb walked Fitch to the door. Outside, Fitch said, "She seems like a determined sort." "She is," Caleb said. "Going to be a challenge, you know. That type." Caleb looked at him. "I'll take that risk," he said, and went back inside. He didn't examine that sentence too carefully until later. That evening, he found Hannah on the back porch, despite the cold, sitting on the step with her coat wrapped around her, looking out at the dark shapes of the outbuildings and the ridgeline beyond. He stood in the doorway. "What are you doing out here?" "Thinking," she said. He went and sat down beside her on the step, which was probably impractical given the temperature, but the question had felt impractical to ask, and he'd asked it anyway, so he might as well follow through. "Fitch bothered you," he said. Not a question. "Men like Fitch are all the same," she said. "They see a woman in an unusual situation and they decide there must be something wrong with her, something off, something that made her end up somewhere ordinary women don't." She pulled her coat tighter. "It's not a new experience." "He's not worth thinking about." "I know." She was quiet, then, "Do you think that? That there must be something wrong with me for being here the way I am?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. "No," he said. "I think you made a series of difficult choices in difficult circumstances, and you ended up somewhere you didn't plan. That's not a character flaw. That's just a life." She turned her head and looked at him. The cold had put color in her face, and the darkness made her expression hard to read, but not impossible. "What about you?" she said. "Do you think there's something wrong with you for being the way you are?" "People certainly seem to think so." "I asked what you think." He looked out at the ridge. The snow lay over everything in a flat blue-gray light, and the wind had died, and the world was very quiet. "I think," he said carefully, That I made a decision a long time ago that felt like protection and turned into something else. Something I've been running on out of habit. He paused. That's not the same as something being wrong. But it's not entirely healthy either. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, we're both pretty broken, aren't we? Most people are, he said. Some of them just hide it better. She surprised him then, let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, though it had something complicated in the middle of it. I suppose that's true. They sat on the step for another 20 minutes, neither of them saying much, the cold working slowly through their coats. It was not a comfortable thing to sit there in the cold with a near stranger, and it was not entirely comfortable to have said the things they'd said in the past hour. And yet Caleb found, when he finally stood up and offered her his hand to help her off the step, that he did not regret a single part of it. She took his hand, just to stand up from the step. Her hand was cold through her glove, and she let go again as soon as she was on her feet, and that was all it was. And yet for a reason he couldn't quite account for, he thought about it for a long time afterward. By the end of the second week, the ranch hands had mostly stopped staring. Hannah learned 2 of their names, a young man named Cole, who was quiet and worked hard, and an older hand called Bitters, who complained constantly, but was apparently the best roper on the property. And they learned hers, and a rough kind of working familiarity was established. Nothing elaborate, just the ordinary acknowledgement of shared space that develops between people who see each other regularly and have no particular reason to be hostile. Garrett told Caleb at the end of that week that the heifer that had been struggling had come through without intervention and was doing well. Good, Caleb said. Also, Garrett said, she reorganized the feed room. I know. Without being asked. I know. Garrett was quiet for a moment. She's going to stay, isn't she? I don't know, Caleb said, but it came out differently than it had the first time he'd said it. Garrett nodded and walked off toward the barn, and Caleb stood in the yard in the cold February air, looking at the ranch house with its lit windows and the smoke coming from the chimney, thinking about the word home and how long it had been since the building in front of him had felt like one, and whether a building could change, and whether a person could change, and whether those 2 things might happen simultaneously, and whether he had enough courage for either. He didn't know the answer, but he was, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, genuinely uncertain. And uncertainty, he was beginning to understand, was different from the hollow predictability he'd been living inside for 7 years. That felt like something. He wasn't sure yet what to call it, but it felt like something. The letter from Clara Prentice arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a supply invoice and a notice from the county assessor's office. Caleb recognized the handwriting before he'd fully pulled it from the envelope. Clara had a particular way of forming her capital letters, wide and emphatic, as though the alphabet itself needed to understand she meant business. He read it standing at the kitchen table. Dear Mr. Mercer, I have heard from several sources that a Miss Reed has taken up residence at your property, and I want to be absolutely clear that this is not what I intended when I placed the advertisement on your behalf. I would ask that you handle the situation with appropriate discretion. I remain concerned for your welfare and for the reputation of all parties involved. He set the letter down and poured himself coffee and thought about the phrase all parties involved, which seemed to be doing quite a lot of work in a sentence that was mostly about Clara Prentice's opinion of her own reputation. Hannah came in from outside, stamping snow off her boots in the doorway. She'd been out to look at the east fence line, which Caleb had mentioned at breakfast was showing some sag from ice accumulation. He hadn't asked her to look at it. She'd gone anyway. Fence is fine, she said. 2 posts are soft, but they'll hold until spring, and the wire's just got some frost weight on it. It'll clear when it warms. Good, he said. She looked at the letter on the table. Bad news? Clara Prentice, he said, concerned about appropriate discretion. Hannah made a short sound, not quite a laugh. She pulled off her gloves and set them on the counter. What does she propose you do about it? She doesn't say specifically. They never do. She poured her own coffee and sat down. I've been thinking about something. All right. I should clarify what I'm here for. She said it without looking at him, which he'd learned meant she'd been working up to saying it for a while. When I came, it was in response to an advertisement about a potential arrangement, a marriage arrangement. She looked up then. But that's not what I'm asking for. I want to be clear about that. I have no expectations in that direction, and I don't want you to feel like I'm maneuvering towards something. Caleb looked at her for a moment. What are you asking for? She considered. Work, she said. A fair wage for what I'm doing. The books, the household management, whatever's useful. A place to live while I figure out what comes next. A pause. I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give. He was quiet, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. That seems reasonable, he said. You don't have to say yes immediately. I know. I'm saying yes now. He looked at her steadily. You've already improved the account books enough to justify 3 months' wages. Whatever you do from here is additional. She seemed to absorb this. And the living arrangement? I don't want the town talking about you any more than they already do. The town talks regardless, he said. I've never been able to stop it, and I stopped trying years ago. He picked up Clara's letter and folded it back into the envelope. Miss Reed, you've done more useful work in 2 weeks than the 3 ranch hands I let go last fall. If Clara Prentice has concerns, she can put them in another letter. Something in Hannah's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a small settling, like a thing that had been held at a careful distance was allowed to come slightly closer. She wrapped her hands around her cup and said simply, Thank you. They finished their coffee, and outside the wind came off the ridge in its usual way, and the ranch went on. March came in gray and stubborn, the way it always did in that part of Wyoming. Not winter anymore, but not yet anything else. Just a long, suspended period of mud and cold drizzle, and the particular kind of exhaustion that sets in after months of heavy weather. The cattle were restless. The horses were restless. Even Garrett, who was normally the most phlegmatic man Caleb had ever employed, started showing up to morning meetings with a look on his face like he was calculating how many more weeks until the grass came back. Hannah had developed a routine by then. She was up before Caleb most mornings. He'd find the stove already lit when he came downstairs, coffee already made, which he hadn't asked for and which he didn't comment on because it seemed like the kind of arrangement that commenting on would make awkward. She worked mornings on the books and on whatever household task had accumulated, spent the early afternoon doing an assessment of whatever section of the property she'd decided deserved attention that week, and spent evenings variously reading, mending, or doing the correspondence that Caleb had been letting pile up since approximately the previous summer. The correspondence was, she had told him, a disaster. You have 3 unanswered inquiries from buyers, she'd said one evening, 3 weeks into her employment, holding up a sheaf of letters she'd found in the drawer beside his desk. One of them is 8 months old. I've been busy. With what? He had not had a satisfying answer for that. She'd drafted the responses herself, brought them to him for his approval. He'd changed 2 words in the first one and nothing in the other 2, and sent them out with the next post. The 8-month-old inquiry had, perhaps unsurprisingly, come to nothing, but the other 2 had generated replies within a fortnight, one of which led to a useful conversation about spring cattle pricing that Caleb would otherwise have missed entirely. You need a secretary, she told him after that. I have one, he said. She looked at him over her papers. I'm not a secretary. No, he agreed. You're more expensive and considerably more opinionated, but the function is similar. It was the closest he'd come to making a joke in some years, and the expression it produced on her face, surprised, cautious, a smile arriving late because she hadn't quite expected it to be available, was something he found himself thinking about afterward. The first serious trouble came in the 3rd week of March, and it came from a direction Caleb should have anticipated and hadn't. He'd ridden into town on a supply run, a routine trip, nothing that needed planning, and stopped at the general store, where a man named Tully Briggs was in the middle of a story he was telling to 2 other men near the counter. Caleb caught his own name on the way through the door and stopped. Can't say I blame him exactly, Briggs was saying. Man's been alone up there for years. Something with a pulse shows up and offers to stay. He's not going to send it away. He laughed at his own comment. The other 2 men shifted slightly when they noticed Caleb in the doorway. Briggs noticed a beat later. His laugh died. Caleb walked to the counter without hurrying, gave his supply list to the clerk, and turned to look at Briggs with the particular quality of attention that he'd been told more than once made people feel like they were being assessed for a potential transaction they hadn't agreed to. I didn't hear all of that, Caleb said. Would you like to repeat it? Briggs was a heavy-set man in his 40s who ran a middling cattle operation 2 townships over and who had never, in Caleb's experience, demonstrated the kind of courage that would justify the bravado he occasionally performed in public spaces. No offense meant, Briggs said. I'll tell you what I'm not interested in, Caleb said, still with that quiet attention. I'm not interested in what you say at your own kitchen table. I'm not interested in what you say in the saloon when you're drinking. But when you're standing 10 feet from me in a public establishment making remarks about a woman who works on my property, I'm going to have a position on that. Do you understand me? Briggs opened his mouth, closed it. Good, Caleb said and turned back to the counter. He drove home with his supplies in a state of particular irritation that had less to do with Briggs specifically. Briggs was stupid and small, not worth serious energy, and more to do with the fact that this was what Hannah had been trying to tell him about, in her careful way. The talk, the assumptions, the way a woman in an unusual situation became a subject for other people's entertainment. He told her about it that evening because it seemed like information she deserved to have. She listened without interrupting, and when he was finished, she said, "What did he do when you confronted him?" "He stopped talking." "Men like that always do," she said, "when there's someone in front of them who might actually do something. They're only brave when they're talking to the air. It'll keep happening," he said. "I want you to know that. What people say, it won't stop because one man was embarrassed." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I stopped caring what people say about me some time ago, or I stopped caring as much anyway." A pause. "What I care about is that it reflects on you, that because of me, you're being talked about." "I was being talked about before you got here," he said. "They just had less interesting material." She laughed at that, a real laugh, quick and unguarded, and it was so different from her usual careful expressions that it caught him off guard, and he found himself looking at her for a moment too long in the aftermath of it, and then looking away. What happened between people who spent a significant amount of time together in a confined space during a Wyoming winter was not romance in any storybook sense. It was less clean than that, and less linear, and far more susceptible to the kinds of ordinary friction that people with difficult histories brought to enclosed spaces. There was an evening in late March when they argued, properly argued, not the careful managed disagreements they'd been having, over a decision Caleb had made about a contract for next year's cattle sales. He'd committed to a per-head price with a buyer from Colorado without consulting her, which wasn't unreasonable on its face since she wasn't his partner and the books were his to manage. But she'd been tracking the regional pricing trends for 6 weeks by then, and she had an opinion, and her opinion was that he'd left significant money on the table by not waiting 3 weeks for the spring figures to come in. "You might be right," he said, which was true. "I am right," she said, which was her way of being frustrated, he'd learned. She didn't raise her voice. She just became more precisely certain. "Even if you are," he said, "I made a decision with the information I had at the time. I had better information. You had a projection. There's a difference." "There's a difference between a projection and a guess," she said. "What I had was a pattern based on 4 years of data. That's not a guess." He was quiet. He was, in fact, aware that she had a point. He was also aware that the reason he hadn't consulted her before committing was that consulting her would have meant acknowledging that her presence had changed how the ranch operated, and he wasn't quite ready to say that out loud to himself, let alone to her. "Next time I'll tell you before I commit," he said. She looked at him, still tense. "I'm not trying to run your ranch," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not trying to take over anything. When I see something that could be better, I find it difficult not to say so." "I know," he said. "I don't want you to stop." She blinked. "You don't?" "No." He set down the contract paper he'd been holding. "The last person who told me an honest operational opinion was Garrett, and Garrett's expertise is cattle, not accounting. I'd rather have someone tell me I'm wrong than have everyone around me pretend I'm right." She absorbed this. The tension in her shoulders came down slightly. "All right," she said. "Then next time tell me first." "Next time I'll tell you first," he agreed. It was not a graceful conversation. Neither of them apologized, exactly, because the thing they were actually apologizing for, the question of what she was allowed to matter in this place and what he was allowed to let her matter, was too large and too awkward to address directly at that point. So instead, they addressed the smaller, more manageable version of it, and they went to bed in separate rooms with the larger question still hanging in the air between them. And in the morning, it was not resolved, but it was slightly less sharp, the way things get when you've at least named them, even obliquely. Spring broke in the second week of April, suddenly, the way it sometimes does in Wyoming. One morning you walk out and the light is different, the air smells different, and the mud that's been frozen into hard ridges overnight has gone soft underfoot. The cattle felt it and moved differently in the pasture. The horses wanted to run. Even Bitters, the complaining hand, came to breakfast in something approaching a good mood. Caleb found himself watching Hannah the morning the spring broke, without meaning to particularly. She was standing at the far end of the kitchen garden, a patch of ground near the house that had been neglected for 3 seasons, with her hands in her coat pockets, just looking at it. He watched her from the kitchen window for a moment. She was measuring something or thinking about something, planning. He went outside. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Thinking about whether there's enough sun here for kitchen vegetables," she said. "The south wall of the house would help with frost cover if I put in a bed along it." She looked at him. "Would you mind?" "Mind what?" "If I put in a garden." He looked at the patch of ground, which was currently exactly what it appeared, a neglected rectangle of earth with some old fence stakes still in it from whatever had been tried there previously. "No," he said. "It would take some work to get the soil right. It hasn't been turned in years." "I can see that." "I'm not asking you to do the work," she said, with a slight edge that told him she'd read something in his tone that he hadn't intended. "I'm just saying it's a project, a real one, not a quick fix." "I know you're not asking me to do it," he said, "and I didn't say anything that implied otherwise." She looked at him sidelong. "You got quiet in a particular way." "I was looking at the ground." "You get quiet differently when you're thinking something you're not saying." He looked at her. "You've only known me 2 months." "2 months of close quarters," she said. "You get a lot of information quickly in close quarters." He thought about that. "What did you think I was thinking?" he asked. "That a garden is a long-term investment," she said, "and that a woman who's only in a temporary situation shouldn't be planning long-term investments." He was quiet for a moment. Not the particular quiet she'd identified, just a genuine pause while he considered. "I wasn't thinking that," he said. "What were you thinking?" "That my father tried to grow potatoes in this spot 30 years ago and never got much from it. Bad drainage." He looked at her. "You'd want to build it up rather than dig down. Raised beds, probably." She looked at the ground again. He could see her adjusting the plan in her head. "That's more materials," she said. "I have lumber in this barn I won't use for anything else." She turned her head and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize, somewhere between gratitude and something more complicated. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'll have Cole pull the lumber out this week." He walked back toward the barn, and behind him he heard her say something quiet that might have been "thank you" or might have been something else entirely. He didn't ask. It was Garrett who finally said, out loud, what everyone on the property had been privately understanding for several weeks. They were in the barn on a Wednesday evening, Caleb working on a piece of harness that needed rewrapping and Garrett doing an inventory of the spare tack, and the comfortable silence they usually operated in had gone on for some time before Garrett said, without looking up from his clipboard, "You know she's planning to stay." "You've said that before," Caleb said. "I'm saying it differently this time." Garrett made a mark on his clipboard. "Before I was asking, now I'm telling you, she's put down roots whether either of you has named it or not." Caleb kept working the leather. "The garden," he said. "The garden's the visible part. It's the rest of it." Garrett flipped a page. "She knows the name of every hand on this property, including the seasonal men who came in last month for fence work. She knows which horses have problems and which ones don't. She's got a notation system in those ledgers that means if she ever left, it'd take someone 6 months to understand what she'd built." He paused. "You've let her build something here, Caleb. Either you didn't notice, or you noticed and you're pretending you didn't." Caleb set down the harness. "She's good at her work." "I'm not talking about her work." "I know what you're talking about." "Then let's talk about it." Caleb picked the harness back up. "Garrett, I've worked 9 years for a man who hasn't said an unnecessary word to another human being since before I came on, Garrett said, still in his clipboard checking tone, still not looking up. I watch this woman and I see you say unnecessary words every day. I see you go out of your way for things you don't have to go out of your way for. I see you tell her things. He finally looked up. That last one is the one that matters. You don't tell people things. You never have. Caleb looked at him. I'm not suggesting you do anything about it immediately, Garrett said, returning to his clipboard. I'm just saying you should be honest with yourself about what's happening. Because whatever you've decided you believe about yourself in relationships, the decision you made after Josephine Alcott, you've been slowly undoing it for 2 months, and the question is whether you're going to keep going or whether you're going to find a reason to stop. The barn was quiet. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Outside, the spring evening was doing what spring evenings did, softening the light and pulling things up from the ground and making the world feel more open than it had any business feeling after a Wyoming winter. She had a bad marriage, Caleb said. She's not looking for another one. Did she tell you that? She's here because she needed somewhere to land. That may be why she came, Garrett said. It's not necessarily why she's staying. Caleb had no answer for that. He went back to the harness, and Garrett went back to the inventory, and neither of them said anything further on the subject. But Caleb turned it over in his mind for the rest of the evening and into the night, and it was still turning when he woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of wind and lay in the dark thinking about the way Hannah had stood at the edge of that garden plot, making plans on ground she wasn't supposed to be planning on. The conversation that neither of them had been having for 2 months finally arrived on a Tuesday night in the last week of April, sideways and without ceremony, the way the significant ones usually do. They'd eaten dinner and Caleb was going over the spring planting records for the kitchen garden. Hannah had started the seedlings in trays on the south windowsill 3 weeks ago, and the operation had expanded with a seriousness he respected. When Hannah looked up from her reading and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You've asked before without permission," he said without looking up. "This one's different." He set the records down. "Then ask." She put her book down carefully, aligning the spine with the edge of the table, which was her particular nervous gesture. He'd cataloged it by now, the way he'd cataloged the tells that horses gave when they were uncertain. "Do you ever think about what you want?" she said. "Not what makes sense, not what's practical. What you actually want." He looked at her. "That's a broad question." "I know. I mean..." She stopped, started again. "I've been here 3 months. And in 3 months you've been decent to me, and fair, and occasionally something more than that. And I find myself wondering whether that's just who you are with people you employ, or whether it's specific." She looked him in the eye then, and there was something in her expression that he recognized, because he'd felt it himself, the particular vulnerability of having decided to say the honest thing and being committed to it now, regardless of the outcome. "I'm asking because I need to know whether I'm reading the situation correctly before I let myself think about it further." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He had, over the past several weeks, constructed and dismantled approximately 17 versions of this conversation in his head, and in none of them had he found an arrangement of words that felt both honest and safe. He was beginning to understand that honest and safe were not always available at the same time. "You're reading it correctly," he said. She looked at him. "I don't know what to do about it," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Knowing something and knowing what to do with it are different things for me. I've spent 7 years making sure there was nothing to do anything about." He stopped. "But you're reading it correctly." She absorbed this. Didn't smile in the relieved way he'd half expected. She just sat with it, the way she sat with most things, giving it room. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it immediately," she said. "I just needed to know I wasn't mistaken or manufacturing something that wasn't there." "You're not manufacturing anything," he said. She nodded once, looked down at her book, looked back up. "I'm scared of it," she said. "I want you to know that. It's not uncomplicated for me." "I know," he said. "It's not uncomplicated for me either." "Two damaged people," she said, a ghost of the not-quite laugh from months ago present in her voice. "Who keep ending up in the same room," he said. She looked at him for a moment, really looked the way she did when she was taking something seriously. And then she said, "I suppose that's not entirely an accident." "No," he said. "I don't suppose it is." Neither of them said anything further about it that night. They sat in the lamplight with their respective papers and books, the stove ticking with heat, the spring wind going about its business outside, and the thing they'd named still in the air between them. But it was a different air now, not the carefully maintained distance of two people protecting themselves, but something more open, more honest, more dangerous maybe, but also more real. And Caleb Mercer, who had spent 7 years in a fortress of his own construction, found that the danger was not as large as he'd spent 7 years convincing himself it was. It was simply a thing in the room, a thing that two people might, if they were careful and honest and willing to fail occasionally, figure out how to carry together. He didn't know yet if they would, but for the first time since he was 27 years old and standing in a field reading a letter that said other arrangements have been made, he didn't already know the ending. And not knowing the ending, he was finding, felt less like falling than he had always imagined it would. It felt, if he was being completely accurate, something close to alive. The days after that conversation had a different texture to them. Not dramatically different, not the kind of change that announced itself. It was subtler than that. The distance that had operated between them, the careful management of proximity that both of them had been performing without naming it, relaxed by some small degree. Not entirely. Not carelessly, but enough that when Caleb passed through the kitchen and Hannah was at the counter working on something, he didn't rote himself around the edges of the room the way he used to. Enough that when she asked him a question in the evening, she asked it directly rather than approaching it from the side. Small adjustments, the kind that people make when they've said the honest thing and survived it. May came in warm, which was unusual for the elevation, and the kitchen garden came up faster than either of them had expected. Hannah's seedlings went into the raised beds the first week of the month, and by the second week there were visible rows of green threading up through the dark soil along the south wall of the ranch house. Cole, the quiet young hand, had taken a particular interest in the project without anyone asking him to, and could sometimes be found in the early morning crouching at the edge of the beds, examining something, which Caleb observed without comment. The ranch itself was moving into its busy season. Spring calving was winding down with a better rate than the previous year, and the cattle needed moving to the higher pasture where the new grass was coming in. There were fences to check and repair, equipment to service, hiring decisions to make about the seasonal hands. Caleb was out from early morning to late afternoon most days, and the evenings were often too short and too tired for much conversation. But the conversation was there, underneath the ordinary operations of the place, and both of them knew it. The trouble that arrived in the second week of May was not the kind Caleb had been expecting, which was probably why it landed as hard as it did. He came back from this north pasture on a Thursday afternoon to find a man sitting in the yard on a horse that had been ridden hard, still breathing heavy, foam at the bit. The man was perhaps 50, thick through the chest, with a suit that was too good for a working ranch visit, and a hat that had been expensive once and had been through some weather since. He sat the horse with the easy authority of someone who expected to be accommodated. Caleb reined up and looked at him. "You Mercer," the man said. "I am." "Name's Aldrich Voss." He said it the way people say names that have weight in certain rooms. "I'm looking for a woman named Hannah Reed." Something went still and careful in Caleb's chest. "What's your business with her?" "Family matter," Voss said. "I'm the brother of her late husband, Silas Reed." He glanced at the ranch house. "She inside?" "What kind of family matter?" Voss shifted in the saddle and looked at Caleb with the measuring look of a man accustomed to deciding how much patience to extend to people who weren't immediately cooperative. "The legal kind," he said. "Silas left a property in Nebraska. Small thing, not worth much. But there's a question about the estate that involves her as the widow. I need her signature on some documents." Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he dismounted, handed his horse off to Cole, who had appeared at the edge of the barn, and said, "Come inside." Hannah was at the kitchen table when they came through the door. She heard them on the porch and turned, and the moment she saw Aldrich Voss, Caleb watched what color she had drained out of her face. She stood up from the table, and she did it the way people stand up when they've received bad news. Automatic, not quite voluntary. "Aldrich," she said. "Hannah." He took his hat off, which was the only concession to civility he appeared to be making. "You're not easy to find." "I didn't think I needed to be found," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, by her sides, were not. "There's the matter of Silas's estate." He glanced around the kitchen with the appraising look of a man pricing furniture. "I've got papers for you to sign. Transfer of a property in Kearney. Small parcel, but it's got Silas's name on the deed with yours. And to clear the title, we need your signature releasing your share." "You came all the way from Nebraska for a small parcel?" she said. Voss looked at her with a slight smile that wasn't friendly. "I like to handle things personally." "What's the property worth?" Caleb said. Both of them looked at him. He'd moved to the counter, where he was leaning with his arms folded, not aggressively, just present, occupying the space. "It's a private matter," Voss said. "Miss Reed works on this ranch," Caleb said. "Any legal matter she's involved in while she's here is something I'd like to understand." "I don't believe that's—" "You can explain it or you can leave the property," Caleb said. "Either one is fine with me." Voss looked at him for a moment with the calculation of a man deciding whether the obstacle in front of him was worth confronting directly or worth going around. He appeared to decide it wasn't worth confronting. 2,000 acres, he said. Kearney parcel, good farmland. Silas had a half interest, with Hannah holding the other half as co-owner. The number was larger than a small parcel. Caleb didn't say so out loud, but he saw something move across Hannah's expression that told him she'd understood something she maybe hadn't entirely worked out before. "Why would I release my share?" she said. "Because Silas's estate needs to be settled," Voss said. "And you're the widow, so legally your signature clears the title and lets us sell." "Sell to who?" A pause. "There's a buyer interested in the combined parcel. Full 2,000 acres. Split deed makes the sale complicated." "You mean impossible," Hannah said. Voss looked at her more carefully now. Something in his manner adjusted, like a man recalibrating a mechanism. "It doesn't have to be difficult," he said. "You sign the release, the estate sells, you get your portion of the proceeds. Simple." "What portion?" Hannah said. "The widow's portion. A fair amount." "What amount specifically?" Another pause, longer this time. "We can discuss the specific numbers." Hannah looked at him steadily. Caleb had seen that look, the precise, unhurried one she used when she was running numbers in her head, and the numbers weren't matching what she'd been told. "No," she said. "We can't discuss the numbers because I'm not signing anything without speaking to a lawyer first. You've ridden a long way, Aldrich, and I'm sorry you've wasted the trip, but I don't sign legal documents without legal counsel. I've learned that much." Voss's expression shifted into something thinner. "You've got no reason to make this difficult." "I'm not making it difficult," she said. "I'm being careful. There's a difference." He stood for a moment with his hat in his hands, the calculation running again behind his eyes. Then he set his hat back on and said, "I'll be in Laramie for the week. I'd encourage you to think it over, Hannah. The buyer won't wait." "Then the buyer won't wait," she said. He looked at Caleb, then back at her, and walked out. After the sound of the horse had faded down the access road, Hannah sat down very slowly in the kitchen chair, as if her legs had decided they'd been cooperative long enough. Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't say anything immediately. He'd learned that her silences after something difficult needed a moment before she was ready to fill them. "He's lying," she said after a minute. "About which part?" Caleb said. "About the amount. About the buyer." She put her hands flat on the table. "Silas never told me about that property. Never once. Not in 3 years of marriage. If it exists the way Aldrich describes it, Silas hid it deliberately, which means the family knew about it and knew I didn't, which means whatever they want me to sign has more in it than a widow's fair portion." She looked up. 1,000 acres of good Kearney farmland is worth, that's not a small estate. That's 10, maybe $12,000 in a sale, more, depending on the buyer. "And if you sign what he brought? If I sign a standard widow's release, I give up my legal interest in the property entirely. In some jurisdictions, it's a complete transfer. In others, it preserves a portion but limits it to a fixed sum rather than a percentage of the sale." She was thinking out loud now, the way she did when she was working through a problem, quick and precise. If the actual sale value is $10,000 and they offer me $500 as the widow's portion, I'd have signed away $9,500. Can he legally require you to sign? No, she said. He cannot. As co-owner of record, I have property rights that require my consent to transfer. He knows that. He can't force me, but he can pressure, delay, make my life complicated until I do. She stopped. Or he can find a lawyer who'll tell me the documents say something different from what they actually say. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You need your own legal representation. I know. I need someone in Kearney, ideally, or at least someone who knows Nebraska property law. She rubbed her face with one hand. I don't have the money for... I'll advance you whatever you need, he said. She looked at him sharply. No. Hannah. No, she said again, not harshly, but with a firmness that was not negotiable. I'm not taking money from you for a legal situation that has nothing to do with you. I appreciate the offer. I mean that, but I'm not... She stopped. I've spent enough of my life in situations where someone else had financial hold over my circumstances. I'm not doing it again, even with someone I trust. He looked at her. The even with someone I trust sat in the room for a moment. All right, he said. Then we find another way. We? She said. You're on my property, he said. A man rode onto my land and pressured a woman in my employment with legal documents of questionable legitimacy. That makes it, in some sense, my business. He paused. And I know a lawyer in Laramie who handles property matters. He's competent and he's honest, which is two things that don't always go together. He'll see you on my recommendation without requiring payment up front. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her weighing it, the independence she'd fought to maintain against the practical reality of her situation. He didn't push. He let her weigh it. A recommendation, she said finally, not a payment. A recommendation, he confirmed. She nodded once. All right. The lawyer's name was Ira Bloom, and he operated out of a narrow office on the second floor of a brick building on Laramie's Main Street, above a land registry office that smelled of paper and old ink. He was a small, unhurried man in his 60s with reading glasses he wore pushed up on his forehead and a manner that suggested he had heard every variety of human difficulty and found none of them particularly surprising. Caleb drove Hannah into town the following Monday. He waited in the outer office while she went in with Bloom, and he sat there for the better part of 2 hours reading a 6-month-old newspaper that the secretary had provided, listening to the muffled sound of conversation through the door without being able to make out words. When Hannah came out, her expression was the particular kind of carefully controlled that told him the news was not good, or not entirely good, or complex in ways she was still processing. She didn't speak until they were outside on the street. Then she said, the documents Aldrich brought are real. The property exists. But Bloom says the release form he wants me to sign is aggressive. It wouldn't give me any percentage of the sale. It gives me a fixed sum of $400 and waives all further claim. $400, Caleb said, against what Bloom estimates could be a sale of $9,000 to $15,000, depending on the buyer and the market. She was walking with her hands in her coat pockets, looking straight ahead. He says my legal position is sound if I refuse to sign. I have co-ownership rights that Nebraska law protects, but contesting it would mean filing in a Nebraska court, which means time, money, and also presence. I'd need to appear, possibly more than once. Can Bloom file on your behalf? He can correspond. He can't appear in Nebraska court himself. She stopped on the sidewalk and turned to look at him. It's a real problem. If I do nothing, Aldrich can tie up the estate indefinitely, and I don't get any portion at all. He can probably manage that for years through procedural delays if he wants to. If I sign the release, I get $400 and give up everything else. If I fight it properly, I need to either go to Nebraska or find representation there, and I don't have the money for either. The sun was out, which felt almost ironic. The street was bright, and the mountains behind the town were still snow-capped and clean, and they were standing in the middle of it talking about the ways in which a dead man's family could reach across the years and make a woman's life smaller. What do you want to do? Caleb said. I don't know yet, she said. I need to think. They walked back to the wagon in silence. He helped her up without making it into something, the way he'd gotten used to doing. The practical gestures that had become ordinary between them without anyone deciding they would. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the road while he drove. After a while, she said, "He knew about the property. Silas. He had to have known." "Yes," Caleb said. 3 years of marriage and he never told me, which means—" She stopped. "It means he was protecting it from me, from any potential claim I'd have." Her voice had gone quiet and flat. "Even then. Even before he started drinking badly, before things got as bad as they got, he was already thinking about what I couldn't have." Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "You couldn't have known what he was hiding." "I know that," she said. "It doesn't make it feel any better." She was quiet for a moment. "I used to tell myself that some part of the early marriage was real, that before everything fell apart, at least the beginning was genuine. And now I'm sitting here thinking that a man who hid a 1,000-acre property from his wife was never being entirely genuine to begin with." She looked out at the landscape moving past. "That's a particular kind of late-arriving disappointment." "It is," he said. He didn't try to make it better. There wasn't anything to make it better. It was just what it was, and she knew that, and she didn't need him to pretend otherwise. Aldrich Voss came back on Friday. This time he didn't sit in the yard waiting. He knocked on the front door, which was, marginally, more civil. Caleb answered it. Voss had a different quality to him today, a tighter energy beneath the surface politeness, like a man who'd been patient and had decided patience had limits. "I'd like to speak with Hannah," he said. "She's available," Caleb said. "Come in." He was not, technically, required to invite Voss into his house a second time. He did it because having the conversation indoors was preferable to having it outdoors, where the ranch hands could hear everything, and because he wanted to be present for it, and because Hannah had asked him, not in words, but in the way she'd said, "Will you be there the previous evening?" and he'd said yes. She was at the kitchen table with her coffee when they came through. She didn't stand up this time. She just looked at Voss and said, "I've spoken with a lawyer." Voss sat down across from her without being invited. Caleb remained standing near the counter. "And?" Voss said. "And the release form you brought significantly undervalues my legal interest in the property," she said. "I won't be signing it." Voss looked at her for a moment. When he spoke again, the surface politeness was thinner. "Hannah, you didn't contribute anything to that property. Silas's family had that land for 20 years before you were ever in the picture. You're the widow of a man who died 2 years ago, and you've been, what? Keeping house for strangers ever since. The $400 is a fair acknowledgement for your signature, and I'd encourage you to take it before the situation becomes more complicated than it needs to be." "Complicated how?" she said. "There are legal mechanisms," he said with the vagueness of a man who is implying a great deal and committing to nothing. "Challenges to the property record, disputes about the circumstances of Silas's death, things that could follow a person." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Caleb could hear the wind in the yard and the distant sound of the cattle in the far pasture, normal sounds of the normal day, and in here a man was threatening a woman over a table with a coffee cup between them. "Say that plainly," Caleb said. Voss looked at him. "You're suggesting legal harassment," Caleb said. "Say it plainly or don't say it." "I'm suggesting that these things get complicated," Voss said. "Miss Reed's lawyer has corresponded with the Nebraska probate court," Caleb said. "Her ownership claim is documented, and her refusal to sign is on record. If you initiate any proceeding against her personally, rather than through proper estate channels, you'll be looking at a counterclaim that will cost your family more than the property is worth." He had not actually verified all of this with Bloom. Some of it he was extrapolating from what he understood of property law and what Bloom had generally indicated. But he said it with the flatness of someone stating established fact, and Voss had the look of a man who wasn't certain enough to push back. "You don't have standing in this," Voss said. "I don't need standing," Caleb said. "I need resources, which I have, and a capable attorney, which I also have. Miss Reed won't be signing a release that misrepresents her legal interest. If your estate wants to proceed correctly, your attorney can correspond with hers and work out an arrangement that reflects the actual value." He moved from the counter to the kitchen door and held it open. "I'll ask you to leave now." Voss sat for a moment, looking between the two of them. Something shifted in his face. Not defeat exactly, more like a strategic retreat, the recognition that the position had changed and he needed to regroup. He stood up, put his hat on. "This doesn't end here," he said. "I expect not," Hannah said. But it ends here today. Voss walked out. Caleb stood in the doorway until he heard the horse leaving the yard, and then he let the door close. When he turned around, Hannah was sitting with her hands flat on the table and her eyes closed, and she was breathing carefully, the way a person breathes when they're keeping themselves together through discipline rather than ease. He sat down across from her and waited. After a minute, she opened her eyes. They were bright, but she wasn't crying. "Thank you," she said, "for the things you said, even the ones that might not be entirely accurate." Bloom said her position was defensible. He said, "I extrapolated from there." "You extrapolated fairly aggressively." Voss was bluffing, he said. "Men like that rely on the other person not knowing enough to recognize a bluff. You needed him to believe the cost of pursuing it was higher than he wanted to pay." She looked at him for a long moment. "You did that for me. You're on my property," he said, which was what he'd said before. But this time they both knew it wasn't the complete answer, and she gave him a look that told him she knew it too, and he didn't try to cover it with anything else. That night, something broke open between them. Not dramatically, not with any single precipitating event, but in the way that pressure that's been building for a long time finally finds a fracture and moves through it. They were on the back porch after dinner, which had become a habit in the warmer weather. The evenings were long now, the sky holding light until nearly 9, and the porch faced west so they got the full length of the sunset. Hannah was in the chair she'd taken to using, the one with the repaired back left leg, and Caleb was on the step, and they were not talking about anything in particular when she said, "When did you decide to stop trusting people?" He looked out at the light fading over the ridge. "I don't think I decided," he said. "I think it happened." "After Josephine Alcott?" "Partly." He was quiet for a moment. "She was the event that made everything else make sense, I think. Before her, I wasn't a warm man. I don't think I've ever been that. But I was more open than I was afterward, less fortified." He picked up a small stone from the porch boards and turned it in his fingers. "She left, and I understood it as a lesson. That what I'd done wrong was let someone see the underneath of things. That if you let someone see that, they can use it." "Use it how?" "Leave with it," he said. "Take it with them when they go." Hannah was quiet for a moment. "She didn't leave with it," she said carefully. "She just left." "I know that now," he said. "It took me a while to understand the difference. That the interior parts of a person don't diminish when someone leaves. That they're still there." He stopped. "I think what I actually couldn't stand was that I'd made myself vulnerable to her, and she hadn't valued it. That was the injury, not the leaving itself. And you decided not to be vulnerable again. To anything," he said. "To anyone." She looked at him. The light was going golden and low, the kind that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. And he was aware of the irony of having this particular conversation in this particular light. "I did something similar," she said. "After Martin, my husband. After everything with him. I decided that what I'd gotten wrong was needing anything from another person, that if I could just be entirely self-sufficient, no one could hurt me again." She looked down at her hands. "The problem is it doesn't actually work. You become very good at being alone, and you mistake that skill for health." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what it is." "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" she said. "That afternoon a couple of weeks ago, when you told Voss that my legal position was documented and on record, half of that wasn't true." "The principle of it was true," he said. "But you said it to protect me," she said. "And the thing is, I've been thinking about that ever since. Because the last person who was supposed to protect me used that position against me. And you did the opposite. You used it for me. And that's, I don't have a tidy way to say this, that landed somewhere deep for me. In a way that I didn't entirely expect." He had turned to look at her fully. She was not looking at him, still looking at her hands. And there was something in the careful way she was speaking that told him she'd thought about this for days before saying it. "Hannah," he said. She looked up. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I want to say that directly. I'm not going to be easy. I'm 40 years old and I've spent 7 years learning how to be alone, and most of what I've been since then has been habits I built in the service of that. Some of those habits are not particularly amenable." "I've noticed," she said with the ghost of something almost like lightness in it, "and you are—" He stopped, started again. You came here with your own history and your own hard-won way of operating, and I don't want to assume that anything I feel means anything about what you feel. I don't want to get that wrong." She looked at him steadily. "You're not getting it wrong," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They sat on the porch while the light finished going down, and the stars came out over the ridge one by one, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. The silence was not the managed, careful silence of two people maintaining distance. It was something different. The silence of two people who have agreed, without quite saying so, to stay, to try, to let the hard thing be hard, and to not run from it this time. Caleb turned the small stone in his fingers a while longer and then set it on the porch rail. He didn't know what came next. He had spent 7 years knowing exactly what came next, because he'd engineered his life to be predictable. And now he had no idea, and he found he didn't mind not knowing nearly as much as he'd always told himself he would. The night came on in its unhurried way, and the ranch was quiet around them, and they stayed on the porch until it got too cold to stay any longer. And even then, neither of them was the first to say it was time to go in. But the letter from Ira Bloom arrived 6 days later. He'd written to the Nebraska probate court directly, as Caleb had suggested, and had received a preliminary response from the Voss family's legal representation indicating they were willing to discuss an arrangement. The wording of the letter was careful and not committal, but it was not a threat, and it was not an ultimatum, and that was, for the moment, enough. Hannah read the letter at the kitchen table and then folded it precisely and set it down and looked at it for a moment. "It's not over," she said. "No," Caleb agreed. "They'll negotiate as low as they think they can get me to accept." "Probably," he said, "but Bloom knows what the property is worth, and he'll hold the line." "You trust him?" "He helped me in a land dispute 6 years ago," Caleb said. "He didn't let me settle for less than the land was worth, even when I was ready to just end the thing. He's stubborn in the right direction." She looked up from the letter. Outside, May was doing its best work. The kitchen garden was showing real growth now, and the meadow beyond the fence had gone from brown to green over the course of what felt like a single week. The ranch looked different in this light, or maybe it had always looked this way, and she'd just been too careful to let herself notice it. "I didn't expect this," she said, and she wasn't talking about the letter. "I know," he said. "When I drove up that road in February," she said, "I had a very modest set of hopes. A place to land, like I told you, some work, some time to figure out what came next." She looked around the kitchen, at the shelves she'd reorganized, and the ledgers she'd revised, and the window above the sink where her seedlings had spent March pushing up toward the glass. "I didn't expect any of this to feel like something that was mine." Caleb looked at her. There were things he could have said, the careful ones, the qualified ones, the ones that left room to retreat if retreating became necessary. He'd spent 7 years becoming very skilled at those kinds of sentences. "It is yours," he said instead, "whatever you want of it." She looked at him for a long moment, and what was in her eyes was not the careful calculation of someone deciding how much to invest in an uncertain situation. It was something more open than that. More frightened, maybe, but more open. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean it." She nodded, slowly, and looked back down at Bloom's letter, and he could see her absorbing it, the letter and what he'd said both, fitting them into the picture she was building of what her life might look like from here. It was not a simple picture. It didn't resolve into anything clean or certain. There were legal battles still to navigate, and the history both of them carried wasn't going anywhere. And the ranch was a demanding place to live, and Caleb was a demanding person to know. And none of that was going to simply dissolve because two damaged people had decided to try. But she wasn't running from it, and neither was he. And after everything, after the year she'd described and the 7 years he'd engineered and all the ways both of them had learned to make themselves small enough to stay safe, that felt like something genuinely hard-won. The morning went on. The garden grew in the sun outside the south wall, and the man who had spent the better part of a decade keeping people at a careful distance sat in his kitchen across from the woman who had driven through a February snowstorm toward a situation that might not exist, and they drank their coffee, and the silence between them was, at last, the easy kind. Bloom's second letter came at the end of May, and it contained an offer from the Voss family's legal representation that was better than the first and worse than fair. They were proposing $1,200 as a full settlement, a fixed sum, no percentage, no further claim, against a property that Bloom estimated could sell for $11,000 to $14,000 in the current market. It was an insult dressed in legal language, but it was also 3 times what Aldrich Voss had offered in person, which meant they were nervous about something. Hannah read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen window with the morning light coming in flat and white, and then set it on the table and went out to the garden. Caleb watched her go without following. He'd learned the difference over these months between the silences that wanted company and the ones that didn't. She came back in 20 minutes later with dirt on her hands and a decision on her face. "Tell Bloom to counter at 40% of sale value," she said. "Not a fixed sum, a percentage. If they want a fixed number, it has to be pegged to an independent appraisal." Caleb looked at her. "That'll push them." "Good," she said. "They should feel pushed." She went to the sink and washed her hands. "Aldrich Voss didn't ride all the way from Nebraska to offer me $400 because it was the right thing to do. He came because he thought I was desperate enough to take it. He thinks a woman alone with no money and no legal resources will sign whatever you put in front of her if you make her feel like it's her only option." She dried her hands and turned around. "I want him to understand I'm not that woman." "You were never that woman," Caleb said. She looked at him for a moment, something crossing her face that he couldn't entirely read, gratitude and something more complicated sitting alongside each other. "I was close to it once," she said. "I don't intend to be again." He wrote to Bloom that afternoon. June arrived and the ranch entered the sustained, grinding busyness of early summer. The upper pasture rotation began, which meant cattle moving and additional fence checking and the constant logistical management that came with larger herds and longer distances. Caleb was in the saddle most days from before 6 until the light failed, and the evenings were shorter than either of them would have chosen. But the evenings existed, and they made use of them. What had shifted between them since the porch conversation at the end of April was not dramatic, and it was not clean, and it did not progress in any neat, linear fashion. There were days when they moved around each other with the ease of people who had achieved something real, and there were days when one or both of them got things wrong in the particular way that people with difficult histories tend to get things wrong, retreating without explanation, or being short when they meant to be thoughtful, or going quiet in the particular fortified way that both of them had been using for years as armor, and occasionally still reached for out of habit. One evening in the first week of June, Caleb came in from a long day to find Hannah in a temper. Not a loud temper. She was too controlled for that, generally, but the kind that radiated from her posture and her movements in the kitchen, tight and contained and doing a great deal of work to stay that way. He didn't ask. He washed up and sat at the table and waited. After a while, she said without turning from the stove, "Bitters told Cole today that I was giving him instructions about the grain storage rotation without checking with you first. Were you?" "Yes." She turned around then. "Because the rotation method they've been using wastes 20% of the storage capacity, and I found a better arrangement. I told Cole, who was happy to try it, and Bitters told him I had no business giving instructions about anything because I'm—" She stopped. "Because you're what?" He said, "Because I'm the housekeeper," she said, which is, I know what he meant by it. It's not about the word. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What did Cole do?" "He used the new rotation," she said, which was the right call. "And I know Bitters is Bitters, and he's never going to be. He's not the problem. The problem is that he's not entirely wrong. I don't have a title here. I don't have a clear role. I manage the books and the house, and I've been, gradually, putting my hand into operations, and nobody's ever actually said that's acceptable." "It's acceptable," Caleb said. "You saying it now and having said it at the beginning are different things," she said. "I should have asked before I started extending into areas that—" "Hannah," she stopped. "You found a better system and you implemented it. That's what I want from the people who work on this property. All of them. I don't require people to ask permission before they improve something." He paused. "And Bitters?" "Bitters has been resistant to every change I've made in 9 years. He resisted when I brought Garrett on. He resisted when I changed the herd rotation schedule. He resisted when I got new water troughs. He'll come around. He always does." She looked at him. "You should have told me about Bitters before I started stepping on his jurisdiction." "Probably," he said. "That's fair." The tension in her shoulders came down slightly. She turned back to the stove. I'm not trying to take over the operational side of things, she said, back in the careful register now. I know you're not trying to, he said, but you're good at it, and I'd rather have you in it than not. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment. I'm going to talk to Bitters. She glanced over her shoulder. Don't make it worse. I'll make it clear, he said. There's a difference. He talked to Bitters the next morning, in the barn, in the direct and private way that was the only way he'd ever found effective with the man. He didn't make speeches. He said that Miss Reed had full authority over any operational matter that touched on the ranch's efficiency, and that if Bitters had a problem with her suggestions, he could bring it to Caleb directly, and that going around her to undermine her standing with the younger hands was not something that would happen again. Bitters was quiet through all of this, studying something in the middle distance with the expression of a man engaged in complex private calculation. Then he said, She's going to be here permanent? That's the direction things are moving, Caleb said, which was, he realized as he said it, the first time he'd said it out loud to anyone. Bitters grunted. She's not wrong about the grain storage, he said, and walked off toward the pasture, which was, from Bitters, essentially a standing ovation. The response from the Voss family's lawyer arrived in the third week of June. They had rejected the percentage of sale counter and had come back with $1,800, fixed, final, take it or leave it. The letter had a clipped quality that suggested someone on the other end was irritated. Hannah read it at the table while Caleb watched. They're not going to move further, she said. Maybe not on the fixed sum, he said. But Bloom said the other option is forcing a sale through the court. If you file to compel a sale as co-owner, they can't block it. That takes time, she said, and it costs money in legal fees over months, maybe longer. I know, he said. She set the letter down and looked at it as if she were looking through it. The $1,800 is real money, she said. I've been thinking about this since the letter came. The $1,800 is real money, and the legal route is a guaranteed cost against an uncertain recovery, and she stopped. I keep running the numbers, and they keep coming out the same way. What do the numbers say? That a certain $1,800 is better economics than a probable $6,000 minus legal fees and 2 years of fighting. She looked up at him. But the economics aren't the only thing. No, he said. The other thing is what it cost me to sign, she said. Not in money, the other kind of cost. She sat back. I've spent a long time letting people define what I was entitled to and then accepting the definition because fighting felt impossible. Martin did it for 3 years. Hargrove did it. And now Aldrich Voss is doing it. She was quiet for a moment. At some point, the act of not accepting the definition matters more than the amount. Then don't accept it, he said. Even if it costs more than it returns? You're the one who has to live with the decision, he said. I can give you my opinion, but it's not mine to make. She looked at him. What's your opinion? He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it honestly rather than reflexively. I think, he said, that $1,800 is not what that property is worth, and signing for it tells Aldrich Voss that the number he put on you was right, and I don't think that number is right. He paused. I also think that if you proceed legally, you should let Bloom's fees run against my account until it resolves, and you can repay me from the settlement. We've had this conversation, she said, about money from you. We've had a different version of it, he said. This version is a loan with a specific repayment structure against an expected recovery. That's not charity. That's a business arrangement. She studied him. You'd do that? The alternative is watching you accept a bad settlement because the right one is slightly out of reach financially, he said. That's not something I'm willing to do if I can help it. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the summer had done what summer does in Wyoming. Gone big and blue and warm, the kind of weather that makes the winter feel like a story someone told you rather than something you survived. All right, she said. Tell Bloom to file. Well, 2 things happened in July, close enough together that later Caleb would have trouble remembering which came first. The first was that Clara Prentice came to the ranch. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, driving her own buggy with her husband nowhere in evidence. Commissioner Prentice was apparently occupied with something in town, which Caleb suspected had been arranged deliberately so that Clara could make this visit without the tempering presence of a man who occasionally had enough sense to suggest she reconsider things. She was a large woman with a commanding manner and the particular confidence of someone who had been right often enough about enough things that she'd stopped leaving much room for the possibility of being wrong. Hannah was in the kitchen garden when the buggy came up the road. Caleb was on the porch. He watched Clara come, and he felt the old, wary irritation at the sight of her, but also something else, something more settled than irritation, because he knew what she was going to say, and he knew what he was going to answer. And for once, the conversation he was about to have didn't feel like a siege. "Caleb," Clara said, climbing down from the buggy, with the dignity she brought to all physical activities. "I've been meaning to come for some time." "Clara," he said. She looked at the garden, where Hannah was crouching at a row of something that was coming up well. She looked at the ranch house, at Caleb, at the yard in general. She was taking inventory, and he let her take it. "I hear things in town," she said. "I'd imagine. I hear that the Reed woman is still here, that she manages the household and some of the accounts." She looked at him steadily. "I hear that you went to Laramie with her, that she's involved in a legal matter, and that Ira Bloom is handling it on your recommendation." "That's mostly accurate," he said. "What do you intend?" she asked, which was Clara's way. Direct, no decoration. He looked at her for a moment. "You placed an advertisement without asking me," he said. "That was presumptuous, and I told you so at the time, but I'm not going to stand here and pretend the outcome has been bad, because it hasn't." He looked toward the garden. "Miss Reed she matters to this place, and she matters to me. That's where it is." Clara Prentice looked at him for a long time. He braced for argument, for the social calculation she usually applied to situations like this, but the propriety angle, the reputation for management, the suggestion that things be formalized in the right way or not at all. Instead, she said, "She's kept you from sending away every person who came near you. That's something I stopped believing was possible." "I nearly sent her away too," he said. "But you didn't." Clara straightened. "I'd like to meet her properly, if that's acceptable." "It's her choice," he said, "not mine." He went to the garden and spoke briefly to Hannah, who came back with him still wearing her work gloves, a smear of dark soil on her forearm. She met Clara Prentice with the same even, unhurried steadiness she met everything, and Clara, to her credit, extended a hand and said, "I've been told I owe you an apology, Miss Reed. The advertisement I placed created a situation for you that wasn't what you deserved." Hannah shook her hand. "You also created a situation that worked out somewhat better than I expected," she said. "So it's a complicated apology to receive." Clara looked at her for a moment, and something in the older woman's expression shifted, a kind of reassessment, quick and genuine. "I see," she said. "Yes," and she almost smiled. The second thing that happened in July was harder. It came as a dream, which was where it always came. Caleb had not been immune to bad nights, though he rarely spoke of them. He had a recurring architecture in his sleep, a version of the field where he'd stood the morning after Josephine Alcott's letter arrived, 27 years old, and holding a piece of paper that had rearranged the world. And in the dream, the field was always larger than it had been in reality. And he was always colder, and the letter was always still in his hand. He woke from it at 2 a.m. in July and lay in the dark for a while, which was what he normally did. But the house was different now in the dark. There was another person breathing in it, in the room at the back, and that fact had a particular quality at 2 a.m. that it didn't have during daylight hours. He got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee he didn't particularly want, and he was sitting there with it when he heard her door open. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in a coat pulled over her nightclothes, hair loose, squinting at the lamp. "I heard you up," she said. "Go back to sleep," he said. "I wasn't sleeping." She came in and pulled out a chair. "I don't sleep well in summer. I know that's backwards. You'd think winter would be the hard one, but there's something about the long light that gets into my head." He poured her a cup without asking. She accepted it without thanking him, which was where they were by now. The courtesies so established they'd become invisible. They sat in the kitchen at 2 a.m, and after a while she said, "You were thinking about her." He didn't ask how she knew. "Yes." "Josephine Alcott." "The dream," he said. "I have it sometimes." Hannah wrapped both hands around her cup. The kitchen was very quiet, the kind of quiet that only existed at this hour. "What happens in it?" "I'm standing in a field," he said, "holding her letter. That's all. It's not dramatic. It's just that. He looked at the cup in front of him. I think what the dream is about isn't her particularly. It's the version of myself that was standing in that field, young enough to still be surprised by something like that, naive enough to not have seen it coming. You couldn't have seen it coming, she said. I know, he said. Knowing that and making peace with it are different operations. She was quiet for a moment. I dream about Martin sometimes, she said. Not the bad parts, the early parts. Which is in some ways worse, because in the dream he's the person I thought I married, and then I wake up and remember I was wrong about who that person was. She looked at her cup. It's a particular kind of grief, mourning someone who wasn't real. Yes, he said. It is. They were quiet together for a while. The lamp made a warm, contained light, and outside the July night was doing its long, light thing, the sky never quite going to full dark at this time of year. Can I say something? She said. You generally don't ask, he said. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to be staying, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever happens with the Nebraska business, whatever happens with the town and what they think, whatever, I'm staying. She paused. I'm saying it directly because I think you need to hear it said directly and not have to wonder. You've spent 7 years waiting for people to leave. I'm telling you, I'm not going to. He looked at her. There was the familiar contraction in his chest, the protective one, the one that said, be careful, don't take that in. She can't know that for certain. Nobody can know that for certain. He felt it, and he recognized it, and he set it aside, which was harder than it sounds and easier than it would have been 6 months ago. All right, he said. All right, she said. That's your response? What would you like me to say? Something more than all right. He considered. I believe you, he said, which is, for me, a significant thing to say. I don't say that carelessly. She looked at him for a moment, and what was in her face was something real, not performed, not managed, just real. I know you don't, she said. They stayed at the kitchen table until almost 4, not talking about anything that important after that. The garden, the cattle, whether Cole was developing into a capable hand or just looked that way, whether the summer would run hot or break early. Ordinary things said at an extraordinary hour, in the particular intimacy of a house asleep around them. When she finally stood up to go back to bed, she paused at the kitchen doorway and said, Caleb. He looked up. The man standing in that field with the letter, she said. He made you careful, but he also made you honest and patient, and you don't run from hard things. A lot of men would have. You didn't. She looked at him for a moment. I'm glad you didn't. She went back to her room, and he sat at the table a while longer, and the July night lightened slowly toward morning outside the window, and the ranch was quiet and present around him. And he thought about the man in the field with the letter, and about the man sitting here now, and considered the distance between the two of them, and whether it was the kind of distance that represented loss or the kind that represented change. He decided in the thin light of early morning that it was the second kind. It had just taken him a very long time to get here. The settlement came through in the first week of August. The Nebraska probate court had reviewed the filing and issued a preliminary order requiring either a negotiated settlement or a court-supervised sale of the property, which had apparently persuaded the Voss family that the cost of continued resistance outweighed the benefit. Their final offer was $3,400. Not the full percentage Hannah had asked for, but nearly 30% of Bloom's conservative sale estimate, and it came without a fixed sum cap, which meant if the property sold for more than estimated, she would receive more accordingly. Bloom recommended she take it. Hannah sat with the letter for one evening and then agreed. She told Caleb the next morning, and he could see in her face the particular kind of relief that his work mixed into it. Not pure happiness, because the money came from a situation that had never been anything but complicated, but something that was hers, a thing she'd fought for and gotten, on terms she'd been able to live with. You should deposit the advance I made to Bloom's fees back into the ranch account, she said. In time, he said. Now, she said. I want it settled. All right, he said. Now then. She sat across from him with the letter on the table between them, and after a moment she said, I want to talk about something. Go ahead. She looked at her hands. I have money now, she said. Real money, more than I've had at any point in my adult life, which means I have options I didn't have before. She looked up. I want you to know that my being here it's not because I don't have options. It's because I want to be here. I want that distinction to be clear. He looked at her steadily. It's clear. But sir, because you need to know that I'm not staying out of necessity, she said. I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go, or because you've made it comfortable and I've settled for comfortable. I'm staying because... She stopped, and he could see her working through the words, not dramatically, but carefully, the way she did when the thing she was trying to say mattered enough to get right. Because this is the first place in a very long time that has felt like it belongs to me in any real sense. And the first person in a very long time who has made me feel like what I contribute is actually seen. The kitchen was quiet. August was at the windows, full and warm, the ranch stretched out in every direction under good summer light. You know I'm not easy, he said. You've mentioned, she said, I mean it practically. I'm not going to change into a man who finds conversation easy or company comfortable by reflex. That's not something I can promise to become. I'm not asking you to become anything, she said. I'm asking you to be here, to keep being honest, to keep doing the thing you did at 2 a.m. in July when you sat in the kitchen and let me sit there with you. She looked at him. That's what I want, not a different version of you. He looked at her for a long moment. Then we're agreed, he said. We're agreed, she said. It was not by any conventional measure a romantic declaration. It was 2 people in a ranch kitchen in August, both of them tired and scarred and still somewhat uncertain, deciding to stop treating the future as a threat and start treating it as a place they were going to together. No ceremony, no performance, just the decision, made plainly, between 2 people who had both learned the hard way that plain was worth more than pretty. Garrett came through the kitchen an hour later, looked at the 2 of them at the table, read whatever was in the air, and went straight to the stove for coffee without a word. He stood there with his back to them for a moment, and then he said, still not turning, I'll start drawing up the numbers for the winter stock order if you want to go over them this week, Miss Reed, which was the closest thing to a blessing that Garrett Swade had ever been observed to give. Hannah looked at Caleb. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that he didn't try to control or compose, and she answered it with something in hers, and that was, in the quiet way of things that matter, enough. The winter stock order that Garrett had mentioned turned out to be the first of many things that Hannah and Caleb worked through together in the official capacity that nobody had quite named yet, but that everyone on the property understood. She sat with Garrett at the kitchen table 2 evenings that week, going through his numbers, and what emerged from those sessions was a leaner order than the ranch had placed in previous years. Not through cutting corners, but through the kind of careful attention to what had actually been used versus what had been habitually ordered that only someone with both the accounting instinct and enough time on the property to understand its rhythms could apply. Garrett, who did not give compliments, told Caleb that the revised order would save the ranch somewhere between $400 and $600 over the winter without any reduction in operational capacity. Caleb passed this along to Hannah. Garrett told you that? She said. Word for word, he said. More or less. She looked quietly pleased in the way she did when something she'd worked on turned out to be right. Not triumphant, just satisfied, the small specific satisfaction of competence confirmed. He'd come to recognize it and to value it, in part because it was so unperformed. Hannah Reed did not need her accomplishments witnessed to believe in them. She just needed them to be real. August wound down and September came in with the particular clarity that high country gets in early fall. The air thinner and sharper, the light at a lower angle, the distances looking bigger than they did in summer haze. The cattle were fat and the grass was holding. The kitchen garden had produced more than either of them had expected for a first season. Tomatoes and squash, and 3 varieties of bean, a run of late lettuce, and enough root vegetables to fill 2 crates that now sat in the cool of the cellar beside the winter stores. Cole had, somewhere over the summer, developed a proprietary feeling about the garden that he would have denied if asked. He could be found pulling weeds on his own time, or checking the bean poles after supper, or reporting to Hannah on the state of the squash, with the slightly too casual tone of a person pretending they hadn't been watching something closely. Hannah noticed and said nothing, which was the right call. Some things grew better without being observed directly. Bitters had made his peace with her in the way bitters made peace with things, by simply stopping to oppose them. He never apologized. He never acknowledged the grain storage conversation or the weeks of low-level resistance that had preceded his recalibration. One morning he came into the kitchen while she was going over the livestock records, set a coffee cup on the table beside her without comment, and went back outside. She looked at the cup for a moment. She understood what it was. She drank the coffee. Participati. The thing that happened in September came not from outside the ranch, as most of the trouble had, but from within Caleb himself, which made it harder to manage. He had been building toward it for weeks without entirely recognizing the process. It presented as ordinary agitation, a restlessness in the evenings, a tendency to go quiet in ways that Hannah had learned to distinguish from his habitual quietness, because this one had an edge to it. He'd go out to the barn after supper for longer than the work required. He'd lie awake, and she could sometimes hear him moving through the house at late hours, the way she'd found him in the kitchen that July night. She didn't push, she waited. It came out on a Thursday evening in the third week of September, when the first frost had just touched the ground the night before, and the kitchen had that early fall smell of wood smoke and something ending. They'd eaten dinner, and Caleb was at the window, which had become his telling posture, hands in his pockets, looking at the yard, not quite present. "Say what you're thinking," she said from the table. He didn't turn around. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it." "That usually means it's something you think I won't want to hear." "It's something I don't entirely want to say," he said, "which is different." He turned from the window then and sat down across from her, and she could see in his face the quality she'd learned to recognize as Caleb being truly uncomfortable. Not hostile, not retreating, just struggling with a thing that didn't have easy language. "We've agreed that you're staying," he said. "We agreed to that in August. I believe you meant it, and I believe I meant it. But I keep finding myself waiting for the version of this where something goes wrong, where one of us realizes we've made an error, and I can't—" He stopped. "I can't tell if that's reasonable caution based on actual evidence, or whether it's just the habit of 7 years thinking I'm going to lose whatever I let myself have." She looked at him steadily. "What would it take," she said, "to stop waiting for it to go wrong?" "I don't know," he said. "That's the honest answer." "Then let me ask it differently," she said. "Is there something between us right now that isn't working? Something real? Not a fear of future failure, but an actual present problem?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "Is there something I've done that's given you reason to doubt the agreement we made?" "No." "Then what you're experiencing," she said carefully, "is the feeling of having something you're afraid to lose, and the fear is telling you to let go of it before it can be taken from you, because letting go feels safer than losing." She paused. "I know that feeling. I had the same one all of last spring. I almost talked myself out of staying twice." He looked at her. "You didn't tell me that." "You weren't ready to hear it then," she said, "and I worked through it myself, which is what you need to do with this." She leaned forward slightly. "Caleb, I'm not going to promise you that nothing will ever go wrong, because I can't make that promise, and I wouldn't insult you by trying. What I can tell you is what I know today, which is that I have not wanted anything in a very long time, and I want this. This place. This us. Whatever we're building here." She looked him in the eye. "That's not going to change because you decided to believe in it." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the early dark was coming down, the September evening collapsing faster than the summer ones had, and the first lamp was lit in the bunkhouse across the yard. "I know you're right," he said. "I usually am," she said, which was not boasting. It was the very slight edge of humor she occasionally deployed when the situation had been serious long enough. He looked at her across the table, and something in him, some last tightly held thing, came slightly loose. Not entirely, not permanently. The fear of loss was not a switch to be flipped. He understood that about himself, had understood it since the conversation with Garrett about habits versus health. It was a weight he'd probably be moving around for years, but it was a weight he was no longer carrying alone, and that changed its character fundamentally. "Hannah," he said. "Yes. I'd like to make this official," he said. Whatever that means to you, whatever form it takes. I'm not—" He paused, because the next part required care. "I'm not asking because it's the expected thing, or because the town is watching, or because Clara Prentice will have an opinion. I'm asking because I want you to have every claim on this place and everything in it that you're entitled to, legally, formally, in every way that can be made concrete." She looked at him for a moment. Her expression was doing several things at once, and she let it do them without trying to resolve them into something simpler. "That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard," she said. "It's an honest one," he said. "It is," she agreed. And then quietly, "Yes." They married in October in the small courthouse in Laramie, with Garrett and Ira Bloom as witnesses. Clara Prentice had wanted to organize something larger. She had opinions about the proper social acknowledgement of an event like this, and she had expressed those opinions in a letter that had arrived in September, and that Caleb had read aloud to Hannah, who had listened with a carefully neutral expression and then said, "I'll write back to her." He hadn't asked what she'd written. The letter Clara sent in response was considerably shorter and more subdued in tone, and no further suggestions about the scope of the ceremony were made. The courthouse ceremony took 12 minutes. Judge Harlan Pruitt, who had known Caleb for 15 years and who had the decency not to make a speech out of the occasion, read the relevant words in a businesslike manner that both of them appreciated. Hannah wore a dark green dress she'd bought in Laramie the previous week. Not expensive, not elaborate, but well-made. And the color suited her in a way that Caleb noticed and did not say, because he was not yet and possibly would never be a man who said such things easily, which she understood and accepted as part of the arrangement. Garrett shook Caleb's hand with the firm brevity of a man who has strong feelings about several things and prefers to express none of them directly. He turned to Hannah and said, "You'll do fine," which was, coming from Garrett, a warm thing. Bloom took them both to dinner at the best restaurant in Laramie, which was not particularly impressive by any objective measure, but which had a decent wine list and a proprietor who did not make the mistake of being curious about the occasion. They ate well and talked about the winter cattle market and the kitchen garden's second-year plans and a piece of land northeast of the current ranch boundary that had come available and might be worth looking into. It was, in every way, a normal dinner between people who had work to discuss. And it was also the happiest evening Caleb had experienced in as long as he could honestly remember, and he was aware of both things simultaneously. On the drive back to the ranch in the dark, Hannah was quiet for a long stretch of road. Not the working through a problem quiet, just the present, comfortable kind. The October night was cold and clear, the stars very bright at this elevation, the road ahead lit by the wagon lanterns. "What are you thinking?" he said, which was not a question he asked often. "About February," she said. "Which part of it?" "When I drove up the road and you opened the door before I finished knocking," she said, I remember thinking, he's going to send me away before I get a sentence out. And you didn't. You just stepped back and said, 'Come in.'" She looked at the dark road. "I've thought about that moment a lot since then, how different everything would be if you'd just closed the door instead." "I thought about closing it," he said. She looked at him. "Not for long," he said, "but the thought was there." "What stopped you?" He considered. "You didn't look like the others," he said. "The three who came before. They all looked like they'd arrived at a transaction they'd already priced. You just looked like a person." He paused. "A cold, tired person who'd driven a long way and had nowhere else to be. That was unusual enough to make me curious." She smiled at that. Not the almost smile or the complicated one, but a real one, quiet and warm, in the dark of the wagon. "A cold, tired person," she said. "That's a fine thing to say about your wife." "It's an accurate one," he said. She laughed, and it was the full, unguarded kind, the same one that had caught him off guard that evening months ago, when he'd accidentally said something that amused her. He still liked the sound of it. He thought he probably always would. The town's response to the marriage was, like most of what Laramie's social community produced, a mixture. There were people who took it as evidence of something they'd always believed about Caleb Mercer, that beneath the difficult exterior was a man who simply needed the right circumstances, which was a story people liked because it was tidy. There were others who had a variety of opinions about Hannah's origins and history, the prior marriage, the months she'd spent at the ranch before any formal arrangement, and they expressed those opinions in the way people in small territories express opinions, quietly, among people they trust, in language careful enough to be deniable. Douglas Fitch, the cattle broker with the too wide smile, made a comment at a Laramie stockmen's meeting that was relayed to Caleb secondhand a week after the wedding. The comment was in the vein of, well, we'll see how long that lasts, and was delivered with the knowing air of a man whose prediction nobody had asked for. Caleb didn't respond to it directly. What he did was terminate the cattle brokerage contract with Fitch at the end of its current term, move to the Rearden operation that Hannah had identified back in February, and receive a meaningfully better per-head rate on the next season's sales. He mentioned this to Fitch in a brief, polite note that made no reference to the comment and required no response. Fitch did not make further comments. Tully Briggs, who had been the man in the general store with the remark about something with a pulse, had the poor luck to encounter Hannah directly at the Laramie market one October Saturday, shortly after the wedding, when she was there without Caleb, choosing dried goods for the winter stores. He recognized her and had the grace to look uncomfortable. She recognized him too. She finished her examination of a sack of dried beans, made her selection, and then looked at him with an expression that was not hostile and was not warm and was absolutely direct. "Mr. Briggs," she said. He managed a hello. "I imagine you've heard the news about the marriage," she said pleasantly. He confirmed that he had. "Good," she said, and went back to her shopping. That was all. She didn't labor the point or perform a victory or give him any kind of speech. She simply let him stand there in the wreckage of his own awkwardness and went about her business. Caleb heard about this from the store proprietor's wife later, in the particular way that things circulate in small territories. And when he mentioned it to Hannah, she shrugged and said, there was nothing worth saying to him. "Some people would have said it anyway," he said. "Some people," she said, "have more energy for that kind of thing than I do." Well, the first year of the marriage was not easy, which is worth saying because the version of this story that tends to get told in the territory is a simpler one. The long, solitary rancher found his match, the capable woman found her home, everything settled into place. That version isn't false exactly, it just leaves out the texture. The truth was that two people who had each spent years developing very specific ways of living alone do not merge those ways without friction. Caleb's silences, which Hannah had learned to read over months of close proximity, still occasionally came out wrong, longer or colder or more closed than he intended, and she couldn't always tell the difference between his thinking quietly and his protecting himself, and sometimes she misjudged it and responded to the wrong one. He found her directness, which he'd always valued as a quality in the abstract, harder to receive when it was directed at something he was doing wrong. He had a temper that he managed well generally, but not perfectly. Once, in the deep cold of January, he said something short and dismissive when she brought him a problem with a vendor account, and she left the room and didn't come back for an hour. And when she came back, she said, "I need you to not speak to me like that again." "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." She nodded and sat back down, and they went over the vendor account and sorted it out. And the apology was not elaborate, and the recovery was not slow. But it had happened, and both of them carried the knowledge that it had happened as a small reminder that what they'd built was not made of indestructible material. It required maintenance. It required, occasionally, the willingness to say I was wrong to someone you loved without waiting to feel less embarrassed first. That last word, loved, was one that arrived quietly over the winter, without announcement or occasion. Caleb didn't say it for the first time in any significant moment. He said it one morning in February, the 1-year anniversary of the day Hannah had driven up the road in the snow, when she was in the kitchen with her back to him pulling something from the top shelf, and he said it the way he said most things, plainly, without performance, as a statement of observed fact. She turned around. She looked at him. "I know," she said, and then, "I love you too." And that was that. It was not the kind of declaration that gets written about, but it was the kind that lasts. Spring came around again, as it does, with its particular cruelty of making the world look possible. The kitchen garden was planned for a second season that would be twice as large as the first, with Cole now fully invested in the project, and Bitters having made a suggestion, unprompted to Hannah while leaning against the fence, about a variety of winter squash he'd grown up eating and had never seen in Wyoming but thought might take to the south-facing bed. She ordered the seeds. The northeast parcel of land that Bloom had mentioned at the October dinner came through in April. The previous owner had finally settled his estate, and the price came in workable. Caleb and Hannah spent 3 evenings going through the numbers before they made the offer. She had a position on the price point that differed from his by $50 on the acre, and they went back and forth on it in the particular manner they'd developed for disagreements. Directly, without heat, each making their case, and neither conceding until the other had answered it. They settled at her number because her argument was better, and Caleb said so. The expansion added 1,400 acres to the north boundary and gave the ranch access to a creek system that would significantly reduce the cost of summer watering. Garrett said, reviewing the arrangement, that it was the best land acquisition the Mercer Ranch had made in 20 years, and Garrett didn't say things like that lightly. The deed listed both their names. Caleb had arranged that without consulting her, and when the papers came back from the county registry, she saw it and went quiet in the particular way that meant she was absorbing something. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "The ranch was yours before I came." "It's ours now," he said. "That's the accurate description." She looked at the deed for a moment longer and then folded it and put it with the other property papers. And that was that. No speeches. No ceremony. Just the fact of it, made legal and permanent, in the way that the things that matter most tend to be made, quietly and with intent. Douglas Fitch sold his brokerage operation that summer and left the territory, which was unrelated to Caleb and entirely related to a series of business decisions Fitch had made over several years that were finally catching up with him. Aldrich Voss, as far as anyone knew, remained in Nebraska managing whatever remained of his brother's estate and did not correspond further. Tully Briggs ran into Caleb at the Laramie Stockmen's meeting the following fall and shook his hand with the excessive cordiality of a man doing penance, and Caleb shook it back and moved on. Clara Prentice came to the ranch for dinner twice in that second year, which was a development that surprised Caleb more than he let on. She and Hannah had developed a correspondence that he was not privy to and had not asked about, and whatever was in those letters appeared to have produced something between the two women that wasn't quite friendship, but was a genuine mutual respect. Two people who were both accustomed to being the most capable person in any given room, learning to recognize that quality in each other. At the second dinner, Clara said to Caleb while Hannah was in the kitchen, "You should know that I've told people in town that I placed that advertisement deliberately, that I'd seen something in you that you couldn't see in yourself and acted on it." "That's not what happened," Caleb said. "No," Clara agreed serenely. "But it's a better story, and it has the advantage of placing the outcome in a positive light, which reflects well on everyone involved." He looked at her. "Clara, you're welcome," she said, and that was the end of that conversation. Yint. There is something particular about watching a person find their way into a life that fits them. Not a perfect life, because perfect doesn't exist in any terrain that real people inhabit, but a life that fits the actual shape of who they are rather than the shape they've been told they should occupy. Caleb Mercer had spent the better part of 2 decades building something impressive and living inside it like it was a structure he was maintaining rather than a home he belonged to. The ranch had been an achievement, and also, for a long time, a fortress. Every wall he'd added to it, also a wall between himself and whatever might require him to be vulnerable again. What Hannah had done, and she'd done it without strategy, without even fully understanding she was doing it, simply by being herself in the particular honest and capable and unafraid way she was make the inside of the fortress livable. She hadn't torn down the walls. She'd put furniture in the rooms. She'd planted things in the ground and fixed the account books and told him when he was wrong and sat beside him in the kitchen at 2 a.m. and said, "I'm staying," in a voice that didn't leave room for doubt. And he had, gradually, imperfectly, with the friction and the missteps and the occasional January morning when something came out of his mouth harder than he meant, he had let her. That was the thing. That was the whole of it, really. She had brought everything she was to his door, and he had finally let her through it. The territory had a version of them that circulated. The story of the difficult rancher and the woman who came in February with nothing and changed everything. It was not inaccurate, but it was incomplete in the way that stories about real people always are. It left out the work. The sustained, daily, unglamorous work of 2 people choosing over and over to keep showing up for each other when showing up was hard. It left out the January argument and the nights when the old fears came back and had to be talked down again. It left out the fact that neither of them was easy or uncomplicated or healed in any final, permanent sense from the things that had hurt them. They just carried those things differently now. Not alone, not as secrets, but as the known history of two people who understood each other well enough to know where the tender places were and to be careful around them. What the territory's version got right was the ending, or at least the shape of it. That the ranch on the high grassland east of Laramie, which had operated for years as a productive and well-run and essentially cold place, had become something else. Not softer, that wasn't the right word. Warmer, maybe. More inhabited. The kind of place where the lamp in the kitchen window at night looked like what it actually was. A house with people in it who were glad to be there. On the second February anniversary of Hannah's arrival, the morning 2 years after she'd driven up the snow-covered road toward a situation that might not exist, Caleb was at the kitchen table with the new season's supply orders when she came downstairs and stopped in the doorway and looked at him. "Do you know what day it is?" she said. "February 7th, he said, without looking up. She looked at him. He looked up. "I'm aware of the significance," he said. She came in and poured her coffee and sat down across from him, and they were quiet for a moment in the morning way they'd developed. The stove warming the kitchen, the light coming in flat and white, the ranch outside beginning its day with the sounds she'd come to know completely. The cattle, the horses, Cole's voice in the yard saying something to Bitters, the creak of the barn door. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd closed the door?" she said. "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think?" He set down his pen, looked at the window for a moment. "I think I'd have gone on the way I was going," he said. "The ranch would have run. I'd have kept building. I'd have been fine, objectively fine for a long time, probably." He looked back at her. "But I don't think I'd have known what I was missing. That's the part that gets to me sometimes. How long a person can go without something necessary and convince themselves they don't need it." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "I think about that too," she said. "I almost didn't come. Did I ever tell you that?" After Bloom's letter, the one Mrs. Prentice sent saying the situation had changed, I sat with the letter for 2 days in Cheyenne. I had a bed at a boarding house and enough money for 2 more weeks if I was careful, and I almost just stayed, started looking for something else. "What made you keep going?" he said. She considered. "I'd already committed to the direction," she said, "and I've never been good at reversing course once I've decided, even when the decision feels uncertain." She paused. "Also, something in Mrs. Prentice's letter made me curious. She said the situation had changed, but she described you in a way that made me think, he doesn't sound like someone who's fine. He sounds like someone who's decided to be fine and keeps having to decide it again." She looked at him, and I understood that feeling because I'd been living it for 2 years. He looked at her for a moment. "You came because you recognized something," he said. "I came because I had nowhere else to be," she said, which was what she'd told him the first day. "But I stayed because I recognized something." The morning light shifted as the sun came up over the ridge, moving across the kitchen in the gradual way of winter light, warming the floor and the table and the 2 people sitting at it. Outside, the ranch was doing what it always did, producing, continuing, operating with the particular indifferent persistence of working land. But inside the house, in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the ghost of last night's dinner, something else was also operating. Not an empire, not a monument, just a life that 2 people had built out of their own wreckage and their own willingness to try, and the belief, tested, confirmed, retested, confirmed again, that opening a door was worth the risk of what might come through it. "I have supply orders to finish," Caleb said. "I know," Hannah said. "I have ledgers to reconcile." Neither of them moved for another 10 minutes. The light came in, and the ranch went on, and they stayed at the table in the warmth of the ordinary morning, which was not a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. Most people who have ever sat in a kitchen that felt like home, with someone they chose and who chose them back, in a life that finally fit the actual shape of them, most of those people could tell you that the ordinary morning is where the real story lives. Not in the dramatic moments or the large decisions, but in the daily practice of being present for another person, of showing up and staying, of letting someone see the underneath of things and trusting that they'll handle it with care. That is what Caleb Mercer had spent 7 years refusing, and what Hannah Reed had spent 3 years believing was no longer available to her. And it is what they found in a ranch kitchen in February, in a territory that is cold and beautiful and indifferent to human struggle. The one thing that all the land and money and careful self-sufficiency in the world cannot manufacture, and that two damaged, honest, imperfect people had managed, against reasonable odds, to build.